Welcome back to my Thracia 776 Ironman. This is Chapter 3. This intro here in the game is a little bit longer than in the previous chapters, so I'm going to cut a couple of more technical, abstract things out of the way first. Number one, in the previous video I was mentioning how, there might be a little bit of Japanese minor knowledge in each video, and how I would add some stuff in the description, mainly like transcripts of the dialogue that I'm talking about in case the video moves too quickly or you don't want to search for it. And I also ended up putting in some extra info below that, just detailing my thoughts a little more. In this particular case, I was purposefully sort of vague because I wanted people to come to their own conclusions and see if they wanted to share their own without me necessarily informing their opinions too much, although I did pretty much tip my hand. I may take that sort of approach in the future if it's not just a statement of pure fact. And number two, I just wanted to give a shout out to the Cy Shyster, who has been commenting on each of the videos so far. At the time of this recording, I had just put up the Chapter 2X video, so I don't know if they are going to comment on that one yet. But I have seen them on other Fire Emblem videos by more prominent content creators, and just around the Fire Emblem subreddit. They do a series that I believe is called Etymology of the Emblem. The stuff they post is always interesting. I suggest checking it out. Maybe just search the subreddit for that sort of thing, and you'll probably find it. I'm sure they have other writing somewhere that they're too good not to. So check it out. And we'll just finish up the intro here with... I think a lot of the translations go with Augustus for the name of this guy, which his name is really more like August or Augusto, I guess you could even say, since all or most Japanese syllables end in vowels, and in this case it would be the O sound. But I actually sort of like the Augustus choice because there is a lot of like Greco-Roman sort of influence in Fire Emblem, although this game leans more heavily into the Irish names and connotations and stuff like that. I haven't really tallied it up, but anyway, starting out here, these three guys that start out to the left, inexplicably, sort of, I don't really know where they're chasing the party from, but I usually send Ashi in to take care of them with Tanya support, because this is the last of the sort of training wheel chapters, and you still have plenty of muscle to send to the main part of the map. You can leave guys behind, either just to mop up those sorts of guys. There are reinforcements that come eventually from the lower left. They're bandits, but I haven't actually seen them in a while because I usually complete this chapter kind of quickly. As you can see by the length of the video, it's not exceedingly quickly, but apparently it's quick enough that once I kill the boss, that's before the reinforcements come. And otherwise that's a good opportunity to train some of these weaker units if you want. The other reason to leave them behind would be because there are some civilians that you need to rescue, and sometimes civilians in this game will move of their own accord once they're set free, but these ones don't. They're children, and they're just sort of helpless. You can sort of see them now. One of the boys and one of the girls at the top there, in a cell just past the entrance to Kerberos Gate. think Safi is about to heal in a moment, so this is a good opportunity to talk about the two new units. Safi being the most important one, and possibly the most important unit in the game when you're playing at like moderate to higher levels. A lot of players, I think, including myself, on my first 1 or 2 runs of this game, one of them being totally blind, kind of underutilized her because in some of the later games, especially like Fire Emblem 7, for example, was my first Fire Emblem, which a lot of people in countries outside of Japan, that was their first game, because that was the first one to be localized officially. And in that game, it's kind of one of the easier Fire Emblems, so you can get by without making too much use of like extra staves. Like I think everybody uses like heal and mend and stuff like that, but it's easy enough, especially on the lower modes, where you don't really need to use those like funny little staves that do things like increasing a stat or like warp, for example, and that ties in well with Thracia because warp is more powerful and more important than in any other Fire Emblem. And a lot of players, including myself at one point, kind of disliked warp because it kind of, in some respects, it may seem like it perverts the way the game is played, kind of like you can skip an entire map or you know, put a character where they really shouldn't be at that point in the map. And if you're the kind of person who likes the combat in these games and just going through slowly and methodically and killing everything, which can be fun, don't get me wrong, then it kind of... Warp is sort of like anathema to that whole style of play. But if you go that way in Thracia, you often are going to be in for a bad time, especially in some very late game chapters. They just throw so much ridiculous stuff at you. It's almost like they really just intended you to do that, just to skip stuff. Although you can do this game warpless. I haven't done it, but I know that people have done it. It is possible. I don't think there's anything that you just can't complete this game without, unless you get rid of pretty much all your stuff that can open doors, lockpicks, door keys, the unlock staff, etc. But anyway, more about Safi specifically. If you don't get her, which is hard to do because of what we talked about, how 2x is hard to miss, then you don't have a healer for this map, and that's not too big of a deal. But Safi starts at a higher staff rank than a lot of untrained priests, and if you get her, I think 10 experience from her starting C rank plus 40, then she levels up to D pretty quickly. I've gotten it in this chapter alone multiple times. I don't think I do here. I think I get it later on. But that puts her closer to warp than any early or mid-game staff user to my memory. And that's really, really important. So important that people often give Safi the Paragon Manual just so they can promote her as soon as possible. And that gives her instant A-rank staff. But she's so close that I personally like to just grind her up using higher level staves that you can procure and steal from various enemies rather easily, I think. That you don't really have to go out of the way so much for a lot of the physics in these early chapters. Because I like to give the Paragon Manual to a different unit that we'll talk about in maybe 10 chapters if we get there. But that's just me. The Paragon Manual is kind of just one of those things that you can give it to whoever you like, or you can give it to, say, Safi, just to make a certain benchmark easier. That's certainly valid, and you save a lot of those like mid-rank staves that I usually just end up wasting, because I usually finish this game with way too many leftover staff uses anyway, without even really trying to hoard them. So it's not that big of a deal for me. But this little middle group of enemies is probably the most eventful part of this map. There's just this cluster of diverse enemies. There's a mage, there's a bunch of archers, including an armored archer. So you can't really have like Ronin or Tanya duel that guy. They just won't do damage. I mean, they'll get plenty of experience. I don't know if I mentioned this, but in this game, you only get experience from, like, you get different experience values from killing an enemy, and then every other action is exactly the same. Like, in some games, if you miss, you only get 1 experience or something, and if you hit, you get the full, like, quote-unquote, hit experience. In this game, that's not the case. If you hit, if you miss, it's all the same. And that goes the same if an enemy is attacking you and, like, they miss, for example. So that's, like, kind of nice, and I don't know if there's a downside to it, and then you get a larger EXP value if you kill, or if you capture. I think the EXP values for capturing and killing are the same, but I haven't ever double-checked that, so don't quote me on that. So anyway, the entire point of me mentioning that is just that having archers, for example, attack armored units isn't necessarily the worst thing you can do if you're trying to level them up. Although it does waste weapon uses, and it does accumulate fatigue, which isn't an issue right now. I think I keep saying that. It will be soon, and I will point out ways that planning out fatigue can actually help you in these next few chapters, even though up until chapter 8 or so, you don't have to deal with the ramifications, because everybody is always deployed. But the other unit that we haven't talked about yet is Rifus or Lifus, depending on your point of view on the L and R aspect of the Japanese language, or lack thereof. He is sitting right above Marty there and below Avel, and he just comes with a lockpick and a scroll, which I will try and remember to talk about scrolls in a moment as well. But the way stealing in this game works is pretty cool, actually. So a thief can steal virtually anything, as long as they have more speed than an enemy, and as long as their constitution is greater than the weight of the item. What this means for Lithus, as far as this chapter goes, is that he can steal, like, vulneraries, which have, like, either no weight or, like, 1 weight, and magic tomes. Although not all of them, I don't think. I think some of the more powerful ones might be heavier, or, like, the siege tomes are heavier. I'm not sure. There is a siege tome in this chapter, but I've never tried to steal it. We'll get to that in a moment as well. I'll try to remember to touch on that. But that one mage there, you can have Lithus steal his tome. I think it's a Thunder Tome. I didn't do it this time because the way that all the units move, it just didn't really work out. And it's kind of better to just have Lithus keep moving and opening doors, so you don't have to spend door keys. I think Avel and Tanya start with door keys. It's good to collect those, and you should use them if you really need to, and if it would really help you, although you shouldn't use them liberally. I would suggest trying to use lockpicks when you can. Another thing of note here is that you see some of my units have gone up into the gated area, but Finn can't go in there unless you dismount him. I'm back on a new recording track with some notes I made based on things I said I would come back to. Number 1, staff experience. It's a little different than experience you get just from fighting, like I was talking about earlier. You get more experience for higher rank staves, including like the hammer and staff, or repair staff, which Safi has, which I don't think I mentioned at all, and it's basically her defining characteristic. It's her personal staff, and she can repair any weapon to full, or staff, just not itself. That would be like a genie granting more wishes with wishes. But it's a great staff. A lot of people like to use it for warp, showing you just how important it is and how important it's regarded to be. But a repair use will give Safi pretty much like a full level, if I'm remembering correctly. And another thing about staves is staff hit percentage. As far as we, and by we I mean like the Fire Emblem community at large, are aware, staff hit can be 100, unlike weapon hit, like capping at 99. And it's based on a formula that involves a unit's skill. So if a unit has below 10 skill, they can have a chance to miss, and if skill is on the low side, like I don't recall off the top of my head how large Safi's value is at base, but you have a pretty good chance of seeing a heal miss in this chapter, which is a good way to ease you into the whole mechanic and know that you can't rely entirely on a heal hitting, and it's good to have vulneraries for when you absolutely cannot afford to miss. Staff missing can actually be a good thing, which once we get to another similar character, I'll explain that more if we get there. I don't want to jinx myself here. And scrolls were another thing that I mentioned. Lithus comes with one, and you can get another one from one of the houses. We'll see that later. Scrolls are highly useful because they not only negate criticals fairly unconditionally, there is one exception, and they also modify growths to some extent. Not unilaterally in a good way necessarily, although, like, you know, if a unit doesn't use the magic stat, then a scroll giving a penalty to a magic stat isn't that big of a deal, obviously, but sometimes they give penalties to things that are useful for anybody, like skill. So they, for the most part, like, if you stack scrolls on a character just kind of blindly, it's generally going to be an okay mix of additive stat bonuses, although sometimes certain scrolls cancel each other out perfectly, more or less. So when I see people with like 5-6 scrolls in their inventory, I do kind of chuckle a bit. I try not to micromanage scroll growth bonus too much. I don't like to power game in that way, and I don't really think that you need to. I find that units in this game just kind of hit the right caps naturally, and a lot of times the other stats that you can boost for them don't really make that big of a difference in the long run. Units tend to be good when they're good, and scrolls don't always fix that, because combat isn't everything in this game necessarily, and because of low stat caps in this game, you can have a maxed out unit and they can still die pretty easily, especially since a lot of late game enemies kind of break the rules a little bit, and it's hard to explain why. So if we get to that point, I'll try and point out some instances where that's true. But, you know, people like to make a juggernaut in this game, and it's always just kind of like, then I hear them saying, well, they died anyway, that they got crit or something, or which I mentioned briefly about it a minute ago. There is one example where you can still get crit, and I say that with quotes around it, sort of, even if you have a scroll, and that is with the Wrath skill, like Ashian has. And you may not have noticed that being a big deal with enemies at all, so far, I haven't had to check skills for enemies much at all. But later on, it's something, it can be a nasty surprise. I have had some harrowing moments with wrath on enemies. It's not like Fire Emblem Fates where skills are everywhere, but I have some stories to tell if we get to like the final chapter, for example. But let me stop and talk about this mage here. I don't know if I mentioned him at all or if I cut that part out because I stumbled over my words a little bit. But this mage has some really good stuff. I'll just go over that briefly in case I already prattled on about it. He's got like an Elfire tome, some keys, so it's good to capture him, and he's stationary, and you know, you can get Dagdar and Avil up there, so it's something that I recommend doing. And if you don't capture him, if you just kind of leave him alone, he does this hilarious thing that enemies just don't really do stuff like this that much in this game, but if you wait too long, he goes up and uses his door key on that door above Dagda, and then on his next turn he opens that first chest, which contains a meteor tome, and then he'll start bombing you. And I didn't have that ever happen to me even on my first playthrough of this. I didn't take that long, but I've seen it happen in other people's streams and stories and stuff, and it's absolutely bonkers hilarious. So that's something to look out for if you play very deliberately, but otherwise, if you know about it, it's not the big of a deal. Worst comes to worst, you could always try and block off that door. And that's another thing, is that those areas where you would stand if you wanted to block off that door, there's actually reinforcements that come at the same time roughly as those bandits I mentioned near the beginning. And as you can see, I'm imminently going to kill this boss, so we're not going to see those reinforcements. This is another one like the first chapter boss where you can flame sword if you want, you can hammer if you want, which is my preferred method. But there's another item that I don't recall off the top of my head in the other chest. You can send Lithus up there as long as you are aware of those reinforcements and have backup or have the boss dead, and grab those chests. Or use the chest keys if you really want to micromanage. And I'll mention that if you really have stuff you want to buy, especially in the middle chapters of the game where there's a lot of good, useful stuff, like stamina drinks, which we'll get to in some of the preceding chapters, then lockpicks and chest keys sell for a lot. And like I was saying before, lockpicks are really useful as far as just being able to save door keys. I mean, they're useful anyway, because they do pretty much anything, including lowering bridges, which is something that isn't a big deal generally in this game, but once one comes up, it's always like, I wish I had a lockpick that I'd brought, or usually there's a bridge key on some enemy somewhere, but it's often a pain in the butt to get. But that's getting ahead of ourselves here. Something random that I'm going to mention, especially since Tanya is being controlled right now, is that if you already have some knowledge of how this game goes, and you know the point at which you get Tanya and Dagda back, you have to visit a Gaiden, and it's a weird Gaiden to get. You have to do some strange gymnastics in order to unlock it. And if you're on like an Ironman like this, and you aren't sure if you're going to be able to unlock that Gaiden, because it's kind of tricky, or you just don't want to visit it, like you don't care for whatever reason, something you can do here is you can get Tanya, probably, or Dagda if you want, killed or captured. And what that'll do is, once you don't visit that future Gaiden, the other character will rejoin you anyway. And that doesn't happen if both of them are alive and you don't unlock the guidance. Don't ask me why it works that way, but it does. And I actually used that to my advantage in my no guidance run, so I could get Dagda back. But, you know, I guess you could get Tanya if you wanted. The support with Ashian is useful. And I often have trouble with Dagda in like mid and late game. So it's gonna, I wouldn't begrudge anybody for choosing Tanya, but for most players you don't have to choose, just know that. This is the part of the chapter where you really, if you haven't already, have to start thinking about managing inventories. So I already said that I was going to freely talk about spoiler territory, but spoiler alert anyway, Leaf and Lithis get captured here after the chapter. They're the only two that you get to keep for the next chapter. And so anything that you want to use in the next few chapters, you want to have in their inventories once you seize. And you don't, like, once the next chapter starts, their inventories are empty, but their items are all going to be in chests in that chapter, so you can get them back pretty much right away. Now, you do want to bring anything that you think can really help you, but you don't want to overburden them, because it's not like, I mean, there's no enemies guarding the chest per se, but there's reasons why you don't want to take a lot of time in the next chapter. And you also don't want to overburden everyone's inventories from that point on, especially in Ironman, where you run the risk of losing that stuff. And you can, at one point during this next little saga, access the convoy, but it's not something that you want to have hanging over your head in these next few dire chapters. So some stuff I would recommend absolutely bringing are the Brave Axe or the Hero Axe. Honestly, it's kind of like a point of contention among more experienced fans, whether you should bring it or whether you should like leave it on Dagda, for example, or just in the convoy or something. I hope that I'm going to be able to demonstrate to you, especially in this very next chapter, just how invaluable it can be, especially if you want to play at a faster pace, if you want to play at a more confident pace. If I had to pick one item or weapon, just one to bring into Manster, it would be the Brave Axe. I guess you could maybe make an argument for the Light Brand. The Light Brand is extremely useful. It acts as a vulnerary for Leaf. If I didn't mention that, you can use it like it's an item from his inventory. It does eat up a weapon use, but it'll save you in a pinch. The scrolls that you get here, I think this time I brought one. And oftentimes I bring both, just because nobody likes getting crit. And there's a few combat units that you can use in these next chapters that you maybe want on the front lines, and you don't want any of them getting crit. Is that the most obvious statement I could possibly make? But you do get at least one scroll in Manster, so it's not like you're going to be without a scroll for the entire time, and there are supports that you can make use of for crit avoid. Like the very next character we recruited is one of those funny characters that's supported by Leaf. And don't get me wrong, it actually does make sense. A lot of the supports in this game, you can kind of feel out the logic behind them, and oftentimes it's very interesting or even amusing, kind of. If I remember, I'll try and point out one of those instances that I find very amusing. I think that would be for 4 Gaiden. Let me write that down, actually. Now, I've been kind of lost in thought here, but So I don't know if I've already done this mistake or done the lack of action that resulted in this mistake, but there's a manner in which I manage the inventories of some of these characters that resulted in kind of a bad situation later. And see if you can figure out what I'm talking about. It might not be who you're thinking about. But it didn't end up being too big of an issue in the end. Maybe that's a spoiler, quote unquote, for this run, but I'll mention it after it's no longer an issue. With Avel, if you have her inventory full of stuff, her stuff goes straight to the convoy. With everybody else, aside from those three characters, Lithis, Leaf, and Avel, they just keep their inventories as they are. So if you already know where a character is going to end up and you really want them to have a particular item, that's especially true of Dagda and Tanya, not so much the other guys, then just make sure that they have it. There's a case, I suppose, you could put something on Safi and Finn if you really need it in the chapter they come back in. The other guys, they just come back between chapters, so they're a non-factor. And then you start getting preps right after that. So you can just manage however you like. But I'm just finishing up delivering the kids back. At this point, I have the order of the kids memorized. I know that from just going to the first house first, I have the person there saying the name Romeo burned into my head, so I know that that's Romeo. The upper right house is Corporal or Kerpra, or however you want to pronounce it. I honestly don't even know what the katakana was going for. And I'm actually going to talk about that in the very next chapter. Some of my commenters gave me a good idea for what to talk about in terms of the Japanese. And I don't think that I have talked about anything specific about the script or any names in this chapter here. And that's because there's just not much dialogue in this chapter, much like a couple chapters ago. So, and there's nothing I can tell that was lost in any of the translations. There's one minor thing that I'll point out, just for posterity. But what you can do, if I didn't mention this toward the beginning, is, you can make kind of a chain, a train of guys that can rescue, because anybody can rescue these kids, even like Safi, if you want her to. I usually use her to run around and, beg heals off of anybody that incurred a hit or something like that. Just for that extra experience. I don't use her, but she can, because kids weigh nothing. And that makes this whole thing go faster with bringing the kids back to the houses. You get 2 items. One's a scroll. Bringing Corporal back doesn't give you anything right now, but it's very important. If you had to pick just one, it might be that one, although honestly there's another case to be made for the last house, which is Ubel, who you have to return him in order to be able to recruit the character in the next chapter. And if you don't, it's like a double whammy because you have to fight that character. So, given the choice to choose between the item you get from Corporal later, which is a warp staff, and Ubel, I don't know what I would choose, but luckily you don't have to choose unless you're trying to LTC, and that's an issue for you somehow. So, whatever. I think you get a ring from another chapter. And I think I mentioned 3 children among the houses. The lower left house is Lucia, or Lucia, however you wish to pronounce it. So if you just have the kids memorized or look up which ones, you can get this going pretty quickly without wasting too many turns. But if you're slow and you have bandits coming at you and you didn't leave enough guys behind, that can get kind of dicey. I don't remember off the top of my head if this is one of those games where enemies will just ignore you and go straight for a village, or if they stop if you're in range at all, or what have. I think maybe they go straight for houses in this game. Again, do not quote me on that. The rings that you get, you can bring to Master if there's a unit that you want to use them on, especially like Asbel, who we'll get to in a couple chapters. People like to give rings to him, and I think I do end up giving him at least one that you get at some point during this. But I often like to give all the rings up to this point to Leif. I recommend in any Iron Man giving a life ring to Leif, possibly the first one. The thing is, no matter how careful you are, and no matter how many support type things you stack on Leif, at some point he's going to get hit, and he might get hit hard. And without that life ring, his HP can be pretty low, like in the low 20s, mid 20s. He's just a ticking time bomb. You're going to goof up at some point, and if he has that life ring, he can survive pretty much anything. Especially if he has a scroll, then he can survive roughly any single hit, unless it's like a Master Axe doubling him or something, So that's my advice, is to give him that. And then also the speed ring is helpful because the light brand doesn't really live up to its name so much. And Leif can actually get doubled by some enemies if he's holding it, and he hasn't had many speed procs, and he doesn't have any speed boosters at all, because his speed will effectively be 0 a lot of the time. But if you do give him that speed ring, he can start doubling enemies later. Not much later, mind you. So I'll just talk about one little minor thing. I can remember in at least one of the translations of this game, it's not entirely clear that Evil surrenders along with Leif here. It made it out, as I remember, more like she snuck in later, which is not what happens. So technically, it's not just Leif and Lithis who get captured here. It's the 3 of them, but they don't all end up in the same place, and under different circumstances. Otherwise, you have to kind of pay attention in the next little story scene to see why that is. And if you are confused at all as to why nobody was in there with them and got captured with them, it's just like, I don't know, the Japanese doesn't make this any clearer, really. But it's just kind of something that you have to use your imagination a little bit, like say, oh, they were busy rescuing the kids, so that's why they didn't get captured, or throwing themselves in with Leif. But that pretty much does it for this chapter, so I will see you in Chapter 4. Thanks for watching.